the grid. So flatten the scene. In fact, actually, we can toggle out of UV editing mode. Go back to default. So flatten the screen. So this is your toggle ortho. And we want front. There we go. So we want these bits snapped to the grid. So at the moment they're off grid. So let's just type some values and get everything snapped. Doesn't matter where to. There is an easy way to do this, but doing it by the numbers makes it easier to understand what's actually going on. Right, so we've got some scaling also to sort out. So select all our objects, so shift right click, and then object, apply, scale. So now everything reads as scale 1, 1, 1. So now that everything's locked to the grid, or moved to whole numbers, we're not dealing with fractions, what we can do is hold the control key down, grab an arrow, and we can move the object, and it moves snap to the grid. And that just makes it easier to reposition the objects, because they have been repositioned to use whole numbers, and they will continue to be manipulated by whole numbers. So that's their lateral position. We also need to alter their front back. And we need the head over the center. So now we have a replica, or replicant, a doppelganger of the original. Now for the next bit, what we're going to do is move these to their own layer. So select them all, right click, objects, move to layer. That'll bring up the layer pop-up, and then just click on one of the little buttons. Click the button we just moved it to, and then what we can do from here is center this on the grid. Like so. What that does, what we just did, one of the problems with Blender, well, it's not a problem, it's an advantage, because it means that you're not locked to a particular perspective to a certain degree. When you've manipulated objects quite a bit, moving around them can become quite awkward. So what you can do is get Blender to refocus, view all, and it'll then just rotate about everything around all the objects that are selected. Ooh, there's a bit of wonkiness there. So that looks like the torso is slightly out of sync, so should that be 20? Nope. I wonder if it's because we moved the origin point. So let's reset the origin of the arms. Just center of mass to geometry. We did that with the legs as well, so geometry. Yes, it's the arms because we moved the arms, so 18. So that now should be perfectly aligned. It is. So as a prep, let's save the file actually at this point. So save as. Right, so the prep for adding a skeleton. Let's make sure that we're facing the right way, so front view. Okay, so what we need to do is add some vertex groups so that we're looking at this from the front, and this is how your vertex groups should be set up from the back. In other words, from the character's perspective, facing forward. So select your objects in turn and create a vertex group. So select one, object properties, object data properties, vertex groups. So object data properties, vertex groups, and then we're going to create a vertex group for this object that we've got selected. And that is arm, that's the left arm, so plus, double click, arm.l, head, torso, so all this has done is created the groups associated with the objects. Now these groups need to be assigned to their respective elements, which is the entire mesh. So edit mode, select all, and it'll still be selected in the vertex group aperture. Click the assign button and test, and do that for the rest of the objects. And this is important because this is what the skeleton actually uses to move the objects. So that's our vertex groups created. So what we can do now is add an armature. Before we do that though, what we want to do, where's the cursor gone? Oh, there it is. So we want to reposition the cursor so that it's at the center of the grid. So go down to 3D cursor, 0, 0, 0. Right, make sure that we're facing the right way. We are. And then add an armature. So add armature single bone. That's tiny. Where is it? There it is. That's super tiny. Right, so this first bone, this is going to be the origin or root of the skeleton. And this bone may change its orientation depending on where the character is going to be used. And this is because the individual orientation of the bone, so if we go into edit mode, switch on axes. So the orientation of this initial bone is going to be defined or depend upon the Z or Z axes, and that's orientation relative to the game world in which the character is to be used. So if Z points forward, you could leave the bone standing upright, but more often than not Z points up. So that means that this initial bone needs to be rotated flat on its back. So keeping the cursor where it currently is, what we can do is switch the pivot point to the 3D cursor, which will move the widget, which will then mean when we rotate the bone, it'll rotate fixed on that axis. And if we can hold control down, that'll snap to degrees, and if you watch the bottom left corner where the numbers appear, that's our rotational value, and we want 90. And then just release, and we can just make this bone bigger, select the nodule or the node at the end, and just make it bigger, move it, which increases the size of the bone. So we can name this root. Right, so we want a very simple armature associated with that. So what's the best way of doing this? Let's just add another bone. So add single bone. It's super tiny again. So we want to switch the pivot point back to the selected active element, and then we can move that, make the bone bigger so we can see it. Now that should not be, and it isn't, it's not attached to root. and that will be our torso. So we can move that up to the torso. But we want the bottom, I think that's the head of the bone. We want that to... Oh, hang on, let me check just how we did that with the other. Okay, so what we basically did was made the bone, so back into edit mode, made the bone basically the same size as the torso mesh. So we want a bone attached to this node at the top, and that will be the head. So what we can do here, rather than just adding a bone, we can extrude. Extrude a bone. So the shortcut for that is E. And that's our head. And because we extruded, these two bones will be linked. They'll be connected. So we need two arm bones. So what we can do here is just add another bone. Single bone. Oh, it's super tiny again. Why are they always so tiny? So make that bigger. Now this is the arm, one of them. So we want to just move that into position. Hold the control key down. And this one needs to be flipped upside down or rotated upside down, because that point around which the bone is rotating is actually going to be the pivot of the arm. Oh, we need to fix that rotation, that roll. So move that. Yeah, that's about right. That'll do for now. Duplicate that. Duplicate. So Shift D. So we've now got a left and a right. And we can use these two bones to create two leg bones. So select, so Shift right click, duplicate, Shift D. And then just move them into position. So that's the basic bone structure or skeletal structure, but what we need to do now is link everything together so that when the root node or the root bone moves, everything else moves with it. So edit mode, so we need to connect the torso bone to the root node. So that's bone relationships. And then we've got down at the bottom here in the relations, we've got the parent. We can click on the bone. Oh, and that's one thing we forgot to do, is rename all the bones. So let's do that now. So select the bone, torso, just display bone names. we go. So that's arm dot r. Oops. Arm dot l. Leg dot l. Leg dot r. Then torso, and we need head. So that should now mean that when we select the torso bone, that'll give us a parent that we can now select as root. I don't know how clear that comes out on screen, but there is now a relationship line from this to this, indicating a connection or a link between the two. So if root is moved now, we have torso and head moving with it because those two bones were already previously connected. So we need to do the same with the remaining bones. So arm, the arm connects to torso. So in parent, there's torso. So again, we've got a relationship line from the head to the tail, or is it the tail to the head? Never remember which way around these are, because the bone is each bone is comprised from 3 distinct components. So we've got these nodes at the top and the bottom as this bone is presented to us. And these are the head and the tail. Can't remember which way around it is. And then you've got the main body of the bone. And you can do different things to these depending on what element is selected and the relationship each has with objects either it's going to be connected to or linked to. So what we're doing is creating a parent-child relationship between the bones. Torso, same for the legs, torso and torso. So this now means that root should move everything, and it does. Excellent. So the next bit, that's our basic armature. So that's our armature, very rough, doesn't need to be more complicated than that for this type of character. What we now need to do is, let me just put this into X-ray. What we now need to do is link the meshes to the armature. So right click the mesh, right click the armature, and then parent object, and you can either keep it as object because we've got vertex groups already set up. You can use object and it'll work. Or armature deform, which will create an armature thingamajig, what's it called? Modifier. So armature deform. Whoops, what did that do? Keep transform. So what we should have now is if we select the skeleton, move that bone, Oh no, it's not doing it. Why isn't it doing it? Okay, so we might have to do this a slightly different way. Select your mesh, modifiers, armature, and then we want, oh, so we've got two armatures. That's right. So we need to name this so that we know that this object is our so that's what we want. So now we should have, whoops, why isn't that working? Hate it when Blender does this. Let's just check the oh, that's why. Now it should work. Yeah, typos. Always check your typos. There we go. So let's try this with this one. So double check the, yeah. It's because it works in some circumstances but not in others. You can directly parent objects together and they will influence one another because you create a parent-child relationship. So when one object moves, the child of that object will also move. But it doesn't always work in for rigging characters. So that moves, that moves. So let's just do the armature move, armature approach. So we're selecting the mesh, modifiers, armature, and then selecting the armature that we want influence over. And we can check. Right, perfect. Save the file. So now we have a rigged character. Let's do a little animation, a little walking animation. So for this, oh, before we do anything, you can manually do this, or you can get Blender to sort of do it automatically for you by enabling these settings at the bottom. At the bottom of the timeline, down here, this section. And what this does is automatically it will insert a keyframe whenever a bone is posed or positioned in the action editor, which is what we will use to create the actual animation. So what we want to do here is activate it. So the red button, we want to store the keys, we want to store keyframes, and the type of keyframe we want is location and rotation, or lock rot. So with that set, we can, whoops, switch to dope sheet, and then switch dope sheet to action editor. Let's flip this to the top. So this is the action editor, it's just a timeline, and what we're going to do, so we're at frame 1, I'm going to create a little walk animation. So you need to be in pose mode for this. So once you've got all your objects parented together, so meshes are parented to the armature mesh, armature object, select your armature object, pose mode, and it'll outline blue indicating the switch, and then we can start animating. So frame 1, select everything, and then just press the I key just to insert everything and create an action. We can rename this. So we've got one frame. Right, so this is a very simple animation. So what we're going to do is swing his legs and arms out. So we're going to switch to the rotate widget to make this easier to do. Select the bone, and just swing the leg out. And we want the arms in the opposite direction, so this one will go back as a counterweight for the leg going forward. And that is a pose. Very simple pose. So we want to do the opposite. Maybe frame 30. So frame 30, we want to do the opposite. So we select the bones, and we're left click dragging the coloured loops of the rotate widget. There is a very simple animation. It's a walk cycle. So what we'll do, select all, copy the pose, so that's these three, well, it's these two buttons, but there's 3 in the series. Copy. I want to move this to frame 60 and paste. So what we now have is a looped or cycling animation. What we can do is, let's test this. So we need to set the frame range. So frame start 1, end is 60, playback 30, and then Alt A. Ooh, this will be very slow because of the streaming at the same time. There's a simple walk cycle. But we can do something interesting to this. About halfway between each pose we have a neutral position. So select all the bones, press the I key to insert, and this creates a midpoint. So when you do that twice, one for either side, because what we can do, click the torso, switch to the translate widget, drop that down a little. Because we want to simulate, we need to copy this pose so we have a duplicate. So copy, marker at the end there, paste. And what this does is it creates or simulates the bobbing motion as the legs go under the avatar. And there is a very simple animation. That's a walk cycle. Make adjustment to that. Rather enthusiastic arm swing. So your first and last frames should be exactly the same. Let's see what playback looks like. Again, this will be very slow because of the streaming at the same time. But generally speaking, you don't move your root bone. That's done by whatever game environment or engine the character would be going into. That would be determined by the engine itself using a forward, left, right, back, what's the word? Vector. So all you do as a character creator is just the walking on the spot. So we've got walk, so let's create another one. Oh, don't forget to press the F, fake user, so that Blender keeps the data in the file. So let's create another one. We'll call this pickup. So it's duplicated the data that we had. So we need to scrub all of that. So select it all and just delete. Reset the pose, so select all the bones in the 3D view, and you want clear transform all, and that just resets everything. So what we're going to do with this one is create a pickup pose. I'm going to tilt his body and then swing the legs back round so they are still on the ground. So we have to move the torso down a little bit because, whoops, it's slightly off center. And if he's left-handed or right-handed, Make the head nod down a little bit. So what we can do here actually is let's grab all of these. So what we can do, so if you hold the Alt key down and right click on a keyframe, it'll select the column, which you can then move. Because what we can do is keep that frame, clear everything. Whoops. And that will give us a transition. Make it hold there for a couple of frames. And then reset. Back to upright. Oh, as it said over. Or, so what we could do here, let's pick up then. Oh, that's blank. Let's do open. So for this one, static pose, so we want a first set of keyframes. Maybe a slight tilt forward. Correct the legs. Whoops. Yeah, so make sure you're always selecting the bones and not the meshes. Arm forward. Head down, looking at whatever it is that he's fiddling with. And then rotate the arm. Oh, actually what we can do here, undo that. We're in global orientation right now, which basically means that the axes are orientated relative to Blender's grid. So what we can do is change that to local, and it'll change the orientation of the widget relative to the bone. So that means that actions like that Right, so I want to copy that. twist, 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 and then stand back upright. Oh, we have to lock the position of the legs and the torso. Otherwise, the character, over the duration of these frames, will, with no information at these points, Blender assumes that the transition is from this frame all the way to this frame, and it will gradually reset the character back to its original position, which we want to avoid. And the same for the head as well. So select the bone, copy, paste, paste, and paste. So a couple of things that we want to watch out for. It moves backwards slightly, so back into global. So that's the fiddling with the key. You could even have the character tilting its head . Trying to figure out why it's not working. And then flipping back. There's all sorts of things you can do. I mean, granted, this is a very simple character. Let's save the file. Save as. But there's a lot you could do. So that's 3. So let's make that's box select, which is the B key. Delete the frames we don't need. So this is a yes. Oops, that's not a yes, that's a no. Whoops. And then reset. Select all those bones, copy, paste. So we have a head nod. Yes. Let's create a no. So we can use the same keyframes, but what we're doing is clearing the animation or pose data for each of those keyframes so that we can use the pose again. So there we have a no. Characters is no. So there we have. So there's a lot more you could do. There's a attack. I don't know how you would do crouch with this sort of character, but there's attack, running, which is basically walking but sped up. There's death poses, so the character dying. Let's do a death pose. So how many have we got? So death. So how would we do this? So we would want to, let's just get rid of these. So we want the character lying on its back. So let's just lie it on its back at the end of the sequence. And position that so its feet are tilt the head so he's died a painful, horrible death. Whoops. All twisted and broke. Right, so we have a end pose. we have a start pose. So we have to determine how the character gets from the start to the end without it just falling over like that. We don't want it to necessarily just fall back over. So maybe at frame we have to make some adjustments, because we have to adjust for the height. And what we're doing is trying to keep the feet positioned relative to grid center, so that we're accommodating a kind of a pseudo shift of the character's center of gravity as they fall back. So they're falling back in a way that makes sense to what we would expect of a physical object. So what we can do, let's say with the torso, the legs twist out first. Need to get rid of that one. So this will be even more of a because you don't just flip backwards your feet unless you're blown off your feet. Almost there. So of course, when the character actually hits the ground, it'll do all the reflexive movements of hitting the actual ground, but that will do for a simple death pose. Let's just reset a couple of bones. And there is our simple death pose. So you start from a beginning and then pose your end, and then all you need to do is work out how you want the character to fall in between the two. So you've got your start and your end. So what we've done is bent the torso and legs so the character kind of is I suppose you could say flopping backwards. And then of course you could, if you really wanted to, do a cartoony death pose, have the legs sticking in the air or something. Yeah, that's quite funny. Right, so there's our death pose. And depending on how you set your frames up, you might be able to even accommodate things like so at this point we could rotate the character so the legs are more or less flat with the ground or aligned to the horizontal of the ground. So it basically means that when the character reaches that point, the legs have got nowhere to go, so the back or the upper half is basically slapping back into the ground. And it's these little tweaks that make your animations a bit more lifelike. Let's just double check and make sure the legs are. Yep. Yep, so that is our death pose. And to change the timing, so if you wanted certain parts of that to speed up, you can select the column of keyframes. So Alt right click, press the G key and just move them so that certain aspects of it, certain aspects of the sequence happen relatively quickly. As opposed to other elements which move quite slowly. So there we have a dying Minecraft man. So that's 1, 2, 3, 6 animations relatively quickly. So we've got walk, pick up, or pick up, open, yes, and no. Save this. So if anyone wants these files, or this last file at least, the one with the animations, I'll drop this in on the forum. Let me just link to that. This is MineCraft. Right, so the file will be dropped in at that URL. So if anyone wants it, it'll be there. Right, so that's 2 hours. So I've done 2 hours. That's creating a simple Minecraft style character from scratch, rigging, and then animating it. Not bad for 2 hours. So do the usual stuff. Subscribe, follow. Subscribe, follow Catspit's channel, the Twitch channel, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I think that's it. Just so that you are notified when the next stream starts. And we shall see you on the next stream. So, bye for now, everyone. Oh, and thanks for watching, lurkers, all you lurkers, and Dev, thanks for watching.